Alors bonjour, hello, comme vous dites ici. Alors je m'excuse auprès de mes hôtes québécois. Comme je ne savais pas s'il y allait y avoir une traduction simultanée ou non, j'ai envoyé un texte en français, mais je vais faire ma présentation en anglais. Par contre, évidemment, les questions, vous pourrez les poser dans les deux langues sans problème. Donc... So this is actually a new research project I'm going to be presenting. It's not something I have done any work on yet, so I'll be very happy to get comments and feedback from all of you who know a lot more about this topic than I do, I'm sure. Also, I should mention that my point of entry is not just care work, but rather domestic work more generally, so including things such as cleaning, for example. I'm not looking specifically at migrant care workers either, but rather at people employed in the formal domestic sector. So, but of course, gender and migration do play an important role in my analysis nonetheless. And what I'm interested in is the introduction of public policies that support and shape the market for domestic work in two different institutional contexts, that is France and Sweden, and the kind of issues that these public policies raise. So my starting point is that while domestic work had progressively disappeared as a form of employment in Europe by the mid-20th century, one can see a real comeback of this form of employment, especially over the past 10 years or so. And when I've been looking at the current literature that looks at this kind of comeback of domestic work, one sees a number of explanations that I put forward, and the idea is that this growth is sustained by a kind of increase in the supply of labor and an increase in the demand that are kind of portrayed as a natural increase in the demand and supply. So on the supply side, of course, what is pointed out is the increasing economic inequalities since the 1980s, the growth in unemployment, and the development of a reserve of low-skilled labor that have increased the supply for such labor. Also globalization, transnational economic inequalities, immigration, especially the strong growth in female migration. Also the development of an economic European area, which has facilitated the circulation of labor within Europe, and not least from Eastern Europe to the wealthier parts of Western Europe. So this has contributed to an increase in the supply. On the demand side, a number of reasons have been put forward to changing family structures that reduce traditional family support, aging populations that increase needs, and also insufficient social care services. Other elements include the sharp increase in women's labor force participation, which has not been mirrored by a parallel increase in men's participation in domestic tasks. But this activity has, of course, reduced households' capacity to carry out domestic tasks. And then also a change in social and cultural norms, that there's an increased emphasis that has been placed on self-realization and professional self-realization, which has translated in a kind of devalorization of domestic tasks. Also a wish for more free time for leisure and for family, and also an increase in dual earners' income, which makes it more possible to delegate some of these domestic tasks. But what I'd like to argue is that what is really new today, and especially compared to other periods when there was a lot of domestic work, such as the 19th and early 20th century, is that now many European countries have set up policies that actually promote domestic services. So it's not just a question of a natural increase in supply and demand, but also there are policies that structure this supply and or demand. So I think it's appropriate to talk about political economy of domestic work, since the delegation of domestic work is being actively encouraged and structured through policy measures. So it's this dimension which I think so far has not received very much attention, and especially not in a comparative perspective, which I want to place at the core of my research project. So I think in my paper I look at the different kind of welfare regimes. I talk about Southern Europe especially, but here I'll just focus on the two cases that I'm interested in, Sweden and France, and so more generally on the continental European countries and the Nordic countries, which have implemented similar policy measures that aim at subsidizing the demand for domestic services. So in continental Europe, quite a few countries started setting up different schemes already in the 1990s to subsidize child and elderly care services, especially through different incentives such as cash benefits, social contribution exemptions for employers, and also different social fiscal measures such as tax reductions or tax credits. Part of the idea in developing these measures, or the rhetoric that's been used, is that it promotes free choice for users who are better able to satisfy their needs as they wish, rather than have to turn towards institutional services. But also the idea has been very much to try and reduce the cost of labor. Indeed, the cost of labor in continental European countries was very much perceived as a problem in the 1990s. That linked to labor market rigidities was seen as stunting employment growth and also being a cause of unemployment. And this was very much promoted. This idea was very much promoted by the European Commission, especially as of 1993. They had what they call a livre blanc that promoted the idea that member states should try to reduce the cost of especially low-skilled labor by setting up different schemes to reduce the cost of labor, especially to develop the domestic service sector, which was seen as an important source of employment. So today, most European countries do support childcare and home care services for the elderly through various social fiscal measures. But some countries have gone even further by subsidizing also services that one can consider as more comfort services, such as cleaning, ironing, but also gardening, snow shoveling, etc. The support takes different forms in different countries. There are vouchers, social contribution exemptions, tax reductions, tax credits. And I would like to say that amongst the continental European countries, France stands out in many ways. First of all, because it's the first country that started introducing these measures as early as the late 1980s. First, more for care services. Also, it's a country that combines different types of measures by there are tax reductions, also social contribution exemptions, plus reduced VAT on these services. So very strong public support for these services. Tax reductions amount to 50% of the cost of hiring someone to perform domestic tasks, up to a ceiling of 12,000 euros per year, which is actually increased depending on the composition of a family. So if you have several children, the ceiling does increase. That's a much higher ceiling than what can be found in other countries that have also introduced tax reductions. For in Austria, it's only 5,500 euros. In Belgium, it's 2,300 euros. So France is subsidizing it at a much higher level. The type of services, the range of services included for these tax deductions is much larger also than what is to be found in other countries. Gardening, but also home tuition, etc. also included. Help with computer problems, etc. All that can be one can benefit from tax deductions for these services. Yes, it was first introduced by left-wing government, but it has been expanded by successive right-wing governments. So these measures actually enjoy a fairly broad political consensus. There are very few debates about these schemes. It's mostly a debate that has been carried out by economists who argue about how many jobs has it actually created, because the different governments have really portrayed this as an important source of employment, and economists have argued that the numbers are actually not the ones that are the official numbers that we are given, and they argue that these new jobs that are created also come at a very high cost for public finances. And then some sociologists, socioeconomists highlight the lack of professionalization in this sector. The workers are not given any kind of training. When I was looking at the example in the movie last night, at least the woman coming from the Philippines did get some training before arriving here. In France, there is no training, basically, even though there should be some. They don't, in actual fact, receive any. And then what is also highlighted in the debate is the very bad working conditions in this field. So just to give some idea of the sector in France, nowadays it's 2 million people who are working in the domestic service sector. According to official data, it's 390,000 new jobs that have been created over the past 5 years. But when that is that is given in full-time equivalents, because these jobs, of course, mostly part-time and very short part-time jobs, it's only 11,000 new jobs that have been created. If one now turns to Northern Europe, here we get a more contrasted image of what's been going on. All the Nordic countries, as is well known, offer a wide range of universal social care services. Care tasks have been externalized to an extent, at least for childcare and elderly care, have been externalized to a much greater degree than in other countries. And the development of care services in the 1970s was very much carried out with the aim of reducing social inequalities, to give everyone access to the same quality services, and also the idea was to promote and support women's employment. So as a result, both the demand and supply for domestic services has been very low in those countries for a long time. Also, there's a very strong ideological reluctance in these countries for delegating domestic tasks, especially cleaning tasks, to others. And in societies that portray themselves as equal, egalitarian societies, that it's very much looked down upon to delegate those kind of tasks. Yet there have been some moves towards supporting domestic services in those countries too. Denmark started in 1996. It was introduced by a left-wing government. It was also a tax deduction scheme at a much lower level than what is offered in France, for example. But that scheme, it was introduced in a period of fairly high unemployment in Denmark, and the idea was to create jobs. In 2004, it was reformed by right-wing government, who said this is very anti-redistributive. It's only the higher income people who are using it. They can afford to pay for these services themselves. This shouldn't be supported through public finances. Also, it wasn't creating employment as they had thought, and it wasn't really doing anything to fight the black informal market. So now it's there's still since the 2004 reform, there's still a tax reduction scheme, but it's only for people over the age of 65. So it's much more to complement elderly care services than for just for cleaning or for comfort services for the whole population. There are also some schemes in Finland and Norway, but also rather limited in scope. So Sweden stands out in this context because Sweden introduced a tax reduction scheme in 2007 after very long, very heated political and media debate. It was introduced by right-wing government, unlike Denmark, as I said, which was introduced by left-wing government, reformed by right-wing government. And so it's really unleashed a big debate about the reintroduction of domesticity in Swedish society. The scheme is very similar to France. It's about as generous. It's also 50% of cost. It's 5,600 euros a year, the ceiling, but that's per individual. So in a dual earner income family, that's actually close to 12,000 you can deduct. It's the range of services included is similar to what is included in France. But the justifications put forward for this measure, for the introduction of this measure, have varied over time. It was first put forward, the idea for this measure in the 1990s. At that time, the idea was that it should promote employment growth. It didn't go through. When it came through in 2006, the justifications had changed. The idea, though, is it was supposed to help families to better reconcile work and family life. It was supposed to promote gender equality by freeing women from domestic tasks. And it was supposed to allow highly skilled workers to invest more time in productive employment. And it was also intended to combat informal work. In the official discourse, it said that it was not intended to replace the public social care services for the elderly, but rather complement existing services to provide more choice. Yet, when you look at the actual conditions for obtaining this tax deduction, it states that the work must be carried out in or in direct connection to the employer's home or to the home of his/her ascendants. So we see a shift here because it introduces a possibility that now children can pay, through this tax deduction, care services for their elderly parents, which is very foreign to how care services have been set up in Sweden until now. If one looks at the impact of this measure so far, in the early 2000s, there were only 2 companies in Sweden providing domestic services. They had 5,500 clients between the 2 of them. Nowadays, there are 67,000 companies in Sweden and 219,000 households employing domestic labor. So this, of course, raises a number of issues. This political valorization of domestic work raises issues that are, I think, common to both contexts and which reflect some fundamental economic and social choices. From an economic perspective, I mean, of course, it represents a non-negligible cost for public finances. It promotes a particular kind of economic model based on the development of low-skilled labor, rather than it's a policy aimed at reducing labor costs rather than trying to upskill labor or to promote activities with a higher added value. One of the justifications that's been used in both countries is that the incentive to buy domestic services is low if income inequalities are low. So demand must therefore be supported through state intervention in order to reduce the cost of these domestic services. Yet this argument could be used for just about any good or service. It's always possible to identify some needs that households cannot satisfy due to income constraints. So why subsidize this particular type of demand? And if its justification is to cover social needs that are not provided for through social care services, is this really the best response, given that only a small proportion of households can actually avail themselves of these services? So it's 7% of households in France using these services, and right now it's 4.5% of households in Sweden. It reflects societal choices. The development of domestic work, as it is structured through these policies, can only prosper in a context of important socioeconomic inequalities. people have to be wealthy enough to be able to pay low-skilled workers. So these policies implicitly promote a societal structure based on a division of labor where the more productive and highly skilled individuals are encouraged to delegate the more basic tasks to others. In both countries, the development of domestic services is expected to respond to the growing care needs of aging populations in a context where care services are insufficient. So the social policy logic is no longer one of subsidizing the supply, the offer of services, but now of subsidizing the demand of services. So that may indicate a transformation in the governance of social policy and through the development of fiscal welfare. And we know the kind of anti-redistributive impact of fiscal welfare that's been studied in other countries. So that really raises issues about the redistributive profile of such measures. So these measures, of course, kind of structure, institutionalize specific socio-economic cleavages between the highly skilled and the low-skilled, but also structures or institutionalizes gender and ethnic cleavages. And while there is some discussion on the type of cleavages that these policies introduce, the debates are quite different in France and Sweden. In France, as I said, the debate is more about how many jobs are actually created and at what cost, and about the poor quality of these jobs. In Sweden, working conditions and quality of jobs are less in focus in the debate. The debate is more about the social inequality, so the class dimension, which we referred to in the early session, between the highly skilled women and the women in the domestic service jobs. So it's more portrayed as a women against women issue, some women being able to make a career at the expense of other women. And also the gender issue is very big in Sweden in the debate, in that some argue that by promoting domestic services that help certain households to delegate their domestic tasks to others, these policies do not address the fundamental gender inequalities linked to an unequal gender division of domestic tasks. So it allows certain households to just sidestep the issue, and it's therefore institutionalizes gender divisions. One type of cleavage that's not addressed in either context, or not very much, is the ethnic cleavage that is being structured or institutionalized. Partly because data is missing. In both countries, they don't collect normally in employment data. There's not any data on ethnic origin and nationality, so it's difficult to get a sense of how that is structured. But the data is available, and various ethnographic studies do show that these jobs are being occupied mostly by women of immigrant origin or foreign. In Sweden, data indicates that 43% of employees are born abroad. Also, there are some links that are appearing with immigration policy. In France, there's a special agreement that was set up in 2008 between the Ministry of Immigration and Ministry of Labor that states that newly arrived immigrants, up to 10,000 per year, should be automatically directed towards the the service sector job, domestic service sector job, to be trained to become domestic workers. In Sweden, there's also been a reform in 2008 of migration policy to help employers bring in workers more easily, more cheaply, and it seems that those who are getting work permits are increasingly people who are going to be working in the domestic sector. Okay, so I don't have time to go over all the research questions I would like to address. But I think you get an idea from what I've just gone over. I just wanted to finish on this, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's a new company that has set up in Stockholm just recently. It's called French Maid Service. So you can hire someone to come and clean your house, dressed in a French maid French maid outfit. And you can get tax deduction for it. And if you go on the website and you look at the different people offering services, some will also offer to do it without any underwear. But you can get tax deduction for that. Thank you.
I'm very grateful to Jane and her colleagues for giving me this opportunity to revisit a project on a topic that is actually quite adjacent to the mainstay of my research agenda, the mainstay being aging, the life course, and intergenerational relationships. So I feel like a little bit of an outsider making or having made an incursion into an area that so many of you are experts in. But hopefully some of the things that I think I learned from the work that I did on this topic and now have the great luxury to reflect on will be of some use to some of you. I note in particular that there are quite a few graduate students here, which is always fantastic to see, and I'm sure a testimony to the culture of cultivating a new generation of researchers at this university. So congratulations on that. Now, Jane has billed this session as being focused on public policy, and while I do make quite a few references to policy, I will also be harking back to quite a few of the themes that were raised in session 1. So the outline of my presentation there, in brief, I'll first talk a bit about the rationale and aims of the study that I'm referring to, about method and methodological lessons. I'll very briefly characterize the sample in our study, and I hope to focus on the conceptual and theoretical insights that we gleaned from our study of migrant care workers in Ireland, because I suppose one of the disadvantages and advantages of working in a tiny country, which, frankly, nobody outside Ireland gives a damn about what happens in Ireland. So that's the disadvantage, but the advantage is that it's always pushing you a bit in the direction of trying to make conceptual and theoretical contributions that would be of interest to the rest of the world as well. So with regard to that, I'm going to talk about sites of diversity among migrant care workers, the ones that matter most, and about the multidimensionality of their lives. Both, as I said, are topics that were touched upon in session 1 already. I'll also talk a little bit about context and change in the context over time, which will lead me to emphasize the importance of at least trying to. I know that for practical budgetary reasons it's not always possible to build that perspective into studies, but I think it would be hugely valuable to seek to do so. And lastly, I'll also make some references to both my own attempts, not particularly successful, but nonetheless important attempts for all of us as researchers on this hugely policy-relevant topic, to talk to the people who are directly engaged with policy. So there were really sort of 3 or 4 main reasons why we decided to look at, the we being myself and my colleague Martha Doyle, look at migrant elder care workers in Ireland. First of all, the fact that we identified a relative paucity of research on non-medical as opposed to medical or nursing professionals among the migrant care workforce. We also identified a relative paucity of research on migrants working with older people in older people's care services, and within that in the formal context as opposed to the informal or grey labour market context. We also wanted to gain a little bit of an insight into the relationships that migrant care workers form with their colleagues and managers, and into how they deal with what we call in social policy literature social risks, both as individuals, privately, within the family, and through their connectedness, if any, to the welfare state. Now, obviously, I can't talk about all of these in the course of this presentation, but the paper contains references to the publications that I and Martha Doyle wrote that cover those main foci of our work. Just so we're clear about it, the definition that we developed and employed in this project of migrant care worker is non-Irish national who enters the country with the preconceived notion of working in the elder care or ends up working in it shortly after arrival. I'm aware other definitions exist, but this is the one that we employed with the view to scoping migrant care workers' perceptions of care work and exploring possible intergroup differences between European, South Asian and African workers. We wanted to also gain an insight, as I said, into their relationships within the workplace with the care recipients, to explore how they reconcile work and family, and to scope their relationship with the welfare state. So I would want to emphasize that we sought to take some steps towards understanding the totality of the migrant care worker experience. Of course, I don't want to advertise that we went all the way towards understanding this totality, but we certainly were very mindful from the beginning of the need to and the interest in trying to view migrant care workers' lives also outside the immediate context of that work. So within this paper, I would like to call for further theorizing on the important sites of diversity in the migrant care worker experience and trajectories, and on the multidimensionality of their lives, in particular the interlinkages and dynamics of work and family lives in a temporal perspective, with special attention to migrant care workers' agency, which strikes me as a particularly under-theorized topic, which was, again, raised by some of the speakers in session 1. I want to highlight the importance of longitudinal study designs and the importance of trying to devise more effective ways of communicating with policy audiences, majority of whom, in my experience, are actually not particularly convinced of need for change in policy or practice. So that's a challenge, to say the least. Now, because our subject matter was not easily quantifiable, we had to ask many sensitive questions, we didn't have a sampling frame, so all of those, of course, point in the direction of qualitative methods. So we sampled purposively across 3 regions of origin based on pre-existing research that showed different experiences of racism by regions of origin in Ireland. We first wanted to avoid using any employer gatekeepers for obvious reasons of selection by them. And we then went through the route of groups that advocate for, work with, organize events and activities for migrants, and to avoid working with a small number of them, which again would have perhaps biased our sample in various ways. We contacted just over 20 of them, and also snowballed out from the people who came forward to the study through these organizations. They were not in all cases, in fact, in very few cases were they in any way activist migrant care workers. Rather, they were people who had been helped by these organizations in various ways, or were in touch with these organizations. At the very end, because we felt we lacked people in institutional care settings, we went to a very small number of nursing home managers, but took great care to minimize their influence. So they distributed information about the study, but that was the extent of their information. And we ended up doing a total of 40 interviews. Now, some of the lessons or some of the things that I would like to emphasize about the method are that I think it's hugely important to acknowledge the contribution and the time of your research participants, which in turn I believe is quite strongly linked to trust and has been shown in, for instance, huge population surveys, longitudinal population surveys, to very significantly drive up participation by people who would simply otherwise not participate, thereby skewing your sample, particularly away from, in these population samples, away from lower income, less educated groups. Within the informal care sector, the gatekeepers, the organizations representing workers, were very important, and also because some of them were much more forthcoming and happier to collaborate with us than others, that did push us towards some groups perhaps more than others, particularly in this case South Asian, who also, thanks to being quite well networked, then pushed us in the direction of other South Asian respondents. I think you need to be very attuned to the very real possibility of social desirability bias in studies like this. You are asking a lot of sensitive questions with any population talking about their work, family relations, their relation to the welfare state. This is a real possibility, and we want to be very flexible, for instance, with our consent procedures. We allowed people to sign with pseudonyms or first name only when it was clear that this made them feel a lot more comfortable and more forthcoming with information. We dealt with language difficulties in some cases by allowing people to be interviewed jointly with one person with better English translating for the person with weaker English. And the overall lesson from that is that you really have to kind of try to work very hard in this kind of studies to steer clear of easy access, compliant participants. Very briefly about the sample, you can get a quick overview of it through these two tables. This is slightly more fine-grained, splitting it up by residential domiciliary within the formal and live-in domiciliary versus not live-in in the grey sector. And you get an idea of the numbers there as well by the region of origin. Now, although we did a lot, I think, to combat the social desirability bias, I think it's still a very real possibility in these studies. And if anybody has more to say about that, I'd love to hear what they've learned about combating that. Now, we can't say this is representative because it's a non-probability sample with a small sample size. And also we can't do a lot of analysis on possible inter-group or rather intra-group differences because of the small sample size. We definitely would have benefited from a closer look at situations in the countries of origin, and we would have benefited hugely from a longitudinal approach. I'm kind of kicking myself now for not having thought about that. So hence my strong recommendation to at least build in that option into your study designs. That's just the references for the published papers. We also produced a 5-page research briefing, which is available on the internet in the interest of trying to communicate with our policy audiences, including the organizations which we used to accumulate the sample. So, conceptual learnings. First, a few words about patterning of diversity. We identified very significant differences by region of origin. Again, because I don't have much time, I won't go through the quotes. I'll just rather say that, inevitably simplifying somewhat, the African care workers' experiences were very strongly marked by racism, discrimination. The European care workers' experiences were characterized by expectations of mobility and, experiences of mobility and relatively high degree of job satisfaction. And the Asian care workers' experiences were coloured by the usually very heavy dependency on the employer and the need to adapt what most of them foresaw as lifelong, up until retirement, careers in care work. Now these were very strongly entangled with the sector of employment, and of course the different legal and citizenship and employment statuses, showing that regions of origin tend to overlap with factors that create, reinforce and perpetuate advantage, or in the case of European and some of the South Asian care workers, and disadvantage in the case of most of the African care workers. I won't go through these characterizations in detail, but obviously you can look up the paper or the publications or these slides. But about this patterning of diversity, so we did find that despite every story being different, it is possible to group migrant care workers by the contours of their experience, and I think that furthering our understanding of this patterning of diversity constitutes a really crucial research agenda. And within that, there's an enormous amount of work to be done on what actually matters and what matters most. And among these factors are country of origin, ethnicity, a discrimination that accompanies it, the facets of the labour care force, because let's say with regard to the African care workers, we found that experiences of racism features much more prominently among the institutional care workers than among the domiciliary care workers. And what among these constituent factors of disadvantage can be addressed and changed through policy. Okay, so diversity is important. Stratification calls for a lot more work, and also agency. I think we have a lot of work to be done in distancing from this. It's a central notion. It's of high relevance for some groups within the care workforce, but we really have to sort of desist the view of migrant care workers solely as victims and understand that the current employment in, I would say, probably most cases, fits in within a broader constellation of family lives and future aspirations regarding both family and work. And again, I would argue that many or most, not all, but many or most migrant care workers do exercise agency. They do strategize. And that, of course, stands in marked contrast to construction of them as powerless victims. And this figure just illustrates some of those dynamics that we identified between work, family, career. Career meaning people's thinking about how they will progress in their work in the future, and the work that we did on, I think, particularly on the calculations and the ambitions that tie in the family, work, career aspects of their lives. So I realize I'm running out of time, so just to highlight not so much the obligations, because I think people have already said quite a lot about that, but the calculations and in particularly the ambitions, which is the notion that for us in theorizing this material interlinks the work and the career axis. Now, for our participants of African origin, for most of them, the ambition was to remain living in Ireland. The South Asian participants expected long care work careers, but not necessarily in Ireland, but rather saw Ireland as a stepping stone and route into other EU global labour markets. Whereas for our European participants, the care work was envisaged in Ireland was not envisaged to exceed 3 to 5 years. But for all, virtually all, there was maybe one or two exceptions to this. Our participants, desired occupational advancements, and as I said, some of them were clearly experiencing a lot more of it than others. And the context in which we did this study, 2007-2008, has of course transformed massively. You might have noticed that there's a bit of a recession going on in Ireland, which is one of the reasons why I'm ruing the fact that we didn't build in the possibility of following up our participants and seeing what happens in the context of a deep recession. This is my last slide. Not in the least due to the changes in policy, the increasing emphasis on home care and cash for care is the very strong possibility that we will see expansion in domiciliary care workforces, and I would foresee quite marked segmentation within that. It's worth bearing in mind that powerful policy actors, for the most part, do not consider this problematic per se. But if we as researchers can accumulate evidence of very deep patterned inequalities that expose some groups to systematic discrimination and limit their long-term life chances and choices, then I think our chances of convincing these policymakers that something has to be done are greatly enhanced. And hopefully that will lead to acknowledgement and addressing of the discrimination and really restriction of possibilities that some groups within the care workforce experience. Also, multiple perspectives on this group of people are hugely important. They're not just defined by either their work or by their family, but rather by the dynamics between the two. And as I said in my outline of our methods and what we learned and what we would recommend, tapping into these perspectives is challenging, and I think as researchers it's important we build space and time, the longitudinal perspective that allows them to emerge. Thank you.
Merci Jane. Je voudrais certainement ne pas oublier en commençant de remercier les collègues qui m'ont invité et qui ont si bien organisé depuis hier soir. C'est un vrai plaisir d'être parmi vous. Et je me sens un peu différente dans ma trajectoire professionnelle. Alors, je ne travaille pas avec les domestic workers, mais par contre, la question qui a été lancée par Jane en termes de l'influence des politiques publiques m'ont inspirée. J'ai essayé d'organiser ma présentation avec différents travaux dont j'ai occupé ma petite carrière de vieille routière, Lucie. Et donc, j'aimerais vous faire part un petit peu d'un mélange, d'une salade mesclant de différentes choses qui vont vous faire, je pense, réfléchir à ce qui a été dit ce matin par mes collègues en termes de la question d'intersectionnalité, de parler de trajectoire et de prendre en compte ces éléments-là pour mieux comprendre comment nos politiques d'immigration se mettent en place et s'articulent. Alors c'est un peu dans cette perspective en tant que professionnel de la santé que je vais vous parler de ce sujet. Alors donc les objectifs, c'est de discuter de certains enjeux éthiques qui sont donc pour moi la conséquence de la réaction du système de santé à l'interaction genre-immigration m'a fait réfléchir aux enjeux éthiques dont sont certainement responsables divers niveaux, incluant le système de santé lui-même. Et j'aimerais en parler dans une perspective de citoyenneté inclusive, tant de la part de ceux qui arrivent au Québec et au Canada que de ceux qui les reçoivent. Et de discuter des conséquences, le mot certain a sauté quelque part, liées aux enjeux de l'immigration et des questions relatives au rapport de genre pour les intervenants en santé publique. Je trouve que c'est certainement très intéressant de pouvoir avoir ces perspectives comparées que nous avons depuis hier sur les questions relatives au genre, à l'immigration et au care qui pour moi a une connotation de la profession de soins dont je vais vous parler, et de réfléchir en même temps au rapport de genre des femmes et des hommes à travers les diverses questions qu'on a posées hier, le film que nous a projeté, et donc de nous faire réagir sur les expériences des femmes et des hommes dont ces expériences se situent dans diverses configurations et reconfigurations qui sont inscrites dans des rapports de genre. Alors pour moi, le point principal étant la santé des personnes immigrantes, le focus de mes travaux, pour moi c'est le reflet de relations complexes et dynamiques entre les facteurs biologiques, psychologiques, sociaux et contextuels. Et vous, en sciences politiques, en droit, vous soulevez beaucoup la question de l'éthique et du droit dont j'essaierai d'insérer dans ma présentation. Cette combinaison de dynamiques de facteurs expose donc dans mes travaux de ce que j'ai examiné de manière très disproportionnée et différenciée dans leur trajectoire de vie, les personnes qui vivent des situations particulières de santé. Et donc, l'expérience migratoire n'est pas une expérience linéaire, mais plutôt construite à travers différentes expériences d'intégration à des degrés variables. Et ça, on en a parlé depuis hier. L'immigration, donc, agit comme un facteur parfois de résilience, et ça je vais vous illustrer quelques exemples, qui aident à réussir une nouvelle vie. Je crois que depuis hier on a parlé justement des expériences des domestic care workers à cet effet, et tantôt comme un facteur de risque pour sa santé, dont je vais vous expliquer quelques cas. Alors dans le cadre de ma présentation, il est proposé de discuter des intersections. Ce matin on a parlé de intersectionality. Moi, j'aimerais vous parler donc de façon plus spécifique de ces intersections entre les questions relatives sur les trajectoires d'immigration et les rapports aux soins dans des sociétés d'immigration telles que le Québec et le Canada. Certains constats seront présentés à travers des situations d'intérêt. D'une part, les défis d'accès aux soins de santé de qualité dans une société qui est marquée par l'immigration. Comment répondre donc pour nous, intervenants de la santé, à cet impératif de personnaliser nos soins, et quels sont les défis d'accès à la profession. On en a beaucoup parlé par rapport aux domestic care workers. Je vous parlerai un petit peu de la profession infirmière et de la profession médicale dans un certain sens, et finalement de voir de quelle façon est-ce qu'on peut attirer notre attention sur les politiques et les programmes dans le domaine de la santé qui vont certainement devoir être revue et recalculée de par l'immigration qui nous affecte. Et j'aimerais faire ressortir donc à cet effet les responsabilités, tout à l'heure j'en parlais, du système de santé, des services sociaux, à donner des soins de qualité dans une perspective de justice sociale. De façon générale, donc, mes préoccupations tournent autour de divers niveaux de responsabilité que détiennent les institutions et les professionnels de la santé à donner des soins qu'on appelle sécuritaires, donc c'est un buzzword très important dans le système de santé, et de qualité dans un environnement qui change constamment, notamment à cause de l'immigration. Et il s'avère que les constats sont tels que les ministères qui élaborent des programmes d'attraction d'immigrants ne font pas nécessairement ce qu'il faut et ne mettent pas de réels moyens en place pour accueillir et intégrer nos immigrants. Alors, quelques exemples donc, que j'aimerais passer à travers vous. Des prémices de base, nous avons la loi canadienne de santé donc, qui va régir de façon générale les immigrants qui arrivent dans le système de santé. Donc, une chose unique quand on regarde la perspective comparée, la France, la Suède, les différents pays, l'Italie qui sont passés avant moi, nous avons une particularité au Canada, c'est la loi du multiculturalisme qui va colorer, oserais-je dire, toute la question d'accès et de défis aux soins de santé, et donc qui va donner des responsabilités particulières au niveau du Québec, où nous avons donc des lois et qui exigent donc un accès équitable selon les demandes des personnes qui arrivent. Il y a également donc à permettre, donc je travaille beaucoup avec des organismes communautaires à travers Montréal, et je travaille donc à présenter certains de ces diapos pour expliquer aux nouveaux arrivants, notamment les réfugiés et demandeurs d'asile, quels sont donc leurs droits, de quelle façon ils peuvent manifester ces droits, et on indique donc dans les responsabilités dans le document que les usagers peuvent se plaindre, leur expliquer comment ils peuvent se plaindre si leurs droits semblent être atteints, et de quelle façon est-ce que l'image miroir de ces droits que les nouveaux arrivants ont, il y a aussi la question de leur responsabilité citoyenne. Donc il y a droit et responsabilité dans les deux sens qui doivent fonctionner, qu'on essaie de faire passer à nos nouveaux immigrants. Leur expliquer la loi 4S qui donc détaille ses obligations et devoirs. Ce que là, j'aimerais attirer votre attention quand on regarde l'intersection entre l'immigration et les trajectoires, c'est de voir qu'il y a au Québec des articles dans lesquels on régit l'adaptation des services aux particularités linguistiques et ethnoculturelles. Donc, les personnes sont en droit de le demander, puisque ça fait partie de la loi, et que nous avons, le dernier point, l'article 171, qui nous dit que nous avons des responsabilités en tant qu'établissement d'organiser nos services, afin de répondre, dans la mesure du possible, bien sûr, aux besoins de nos populations. Et pour les intervenants eux-mêmes, de revoir de quelle façon nous appliquons les normes et les lois et nos codes de profession, de par un point important que j'aime toujours attirer l'attention quand je forme les nouveaux arrivants, notamment les infirmières et les médecins qui sont diplômés hors Québec, qu'on appelle, vous allez voir dans les journaux ou ailleurs, les DHQ, ce sont les diplômés hors Québec, n'est-ce pas ? Et donc qui doivent, dans un certain sens, aussi mieux connaître leurs impératifs dans les soins à donner dans les deux sens. Alors, un des constats, c'est bien sûr, on ne peut pas choisir nos malades, donc il va falloir se débrouiller pour donner des soins sécuritaires malgré tout. Et on s'aperçoit aussi que dans un contexte où nous avons des nouveaux arrivants, nous avons beaucoup parlé depuis hier de toute question de trajectoire, de mieux comprendre qui sont les personnes. Ce matin, l'exemple du repassage donne une très bonne idée de mieux comprendre donc les trajectoires et qui sont les personnes qui viennent d'ailleurs pour pouvoir mieux les desservir. Et un autre point que j'avais mentionné dans les... Et oui, ça fait partie de cette notion de déqualification professionnelle qui habite tant de nos immigrants, la majorité, si j'ose dire, de nos domestic care workers et de nos taxis et de nos parking attendants sont des personnes qui ont été formées comme avocats, comme chirurgiens, comme dentistes et comme infirmiers, qui ne réussissent pas à trouver du travail et qui se heurtent à toutes sortes de barrières et de filtres pour essayer de se faire comprendre de qui ils sont et de comment on peut même intervenir dans ce domaine-là. Alors évidemment, l'autre chose qu'on peut proposer, et c'est un des points que j'aborderai un petit peu plus tard dans ma présentation, que fait-on avec ceux qui viennent, qui parlent plusieurs langues, mais qui ne peuvent pas se requalifier dans leur propre domaine? Alors bon, on les enverra ailleurs traduire. Et là encore, on a d'autres préoccupations. D'une part, on en a besoin pour les articles de loi dont je vous ai présenté, de communiquer et de pouvoir bien échanger, mais en même temps, on perd encore une fois la valeur de ces personnes formées ailleurs, et je vous expliquerai comment on les utilise du mieux que l'on peut. Donc, pour nous, la responsabilité, elle est vraiment de se dire, est-ce que l'interaction immigration, santé, accueil dans notre système de santé, rapport aux soins de santé, nous exige que nous devions mettre des stratégies d'approche interculturelle, multiculturelle, on a toutes sortes de transculturelles, toutes sortes de mots, ou bien, moi la question que je pose à mes collègues, mes étudiants, n'est-ce pas tout simplement notre pratique quotidienne? L'autre est forcément différent, qu'ils viennent d'ailleurs ou non. Et donc, comment se repositionne-t-on en enlevant cette espèce d'étiquette du fait que c'est peut-être un migrant? Non, c'est une personne tout simplement. Et nous avons observé dans les travaux qui ont été faits par des collègues d'ailleurs de Jill Henley, qui je crois devait venir mais qui va certainement arriver. C'est Bartlett Gillian qui travaille aussi à McGill dans le département où est Jill, où nous avons regardé donc à travers le Québec ce qui causait souci quand on essaie d'avoir une prestation sécuritaire de soins. Il n'y a pas longtemps, on a eu le rapport qui est sorti des incidents, accidents du système dans les établissements de santé. Et ce qu'on voit, c'est, même si on ne recherche pas la communication et l'échange, c'est ce qui ressort dans les travaux, qui étaient plus susceptibles d'avoir des événements qu'on appelle indésirables, évitables. Donc à cause de ce manque de communication, attribuable beaucoup à l'immigration, on a des événements indésirables qu'on aurait pu éviter si on avait mieux géré. Et on voit donc dans les écrits des travaux que je fais depuis quelque temps, c'est la barrière linguistique qui est le premier souci, non pas tant la barrière culturelle, le fait d'avoir toutes sortes de préoccupations. On va revenir au rapport de genre, mais certainement qu'il y a donc cette préoccupation que les personnes ont. On se dit, oh, elle est très différente, elle a sûrement 3 mères dans son pays d'origine, je ne sais trop, elle est très bizarre. Mais en fait, c'est vraiment la question de pouvoir parler aux gens de façon claire, de pouvoir échanger, qui font que nous avons ce problème linguistique, non pas tant de langue en soi, mais aussi nos médecins, infirmières qui ont leur propre langage particulier, qui font que nous avons besoin de prendre des mesures raisonnables pour mieux communiquer et pour mieux faire passer donc la compréhension et l'importance d'un consentement écrit. Donc c'est là où j'arrive à l'illustration de mon premier cas, le fait que si on n'a pas réussi à parler correctement, on ne peut pas échanger, on ne peut pas obtenir un consentement. Et quand on n'obtient pas un consentement, il y a bien sûr l'aggravation de l'état de santé, des responsabilités de l'établissement de santé, de l'organisation de soins de santé qui donc va avoir des erreurs de toutes sortes et notamment les coûts. Alors pour vous, et la performance qui est l'autre mot-clé important en ce moment dans le système de santé, pour vous qui êtes en droit, qui êtes en sciences politiques, la notion de coût est très importante. Ma collègue tout à l'heure, la première qui a parlé, Nathalie, a montré un petit peu quelques scénarios. Pour nous, évidemment, c'est important, les coûts, mais le plus grave, c'est que si je ne donne pas des soins de santé de qualité, ultimement, ce qui va arriver, la personne risque de décéder. Ça coûte cher et tout, c'est compliqué. Et qu'est-ce qu'on retrouve, et on veut éviter, évidemment, parce qu'on a vu que, à cause de la question de l'immigration et de la barrière linguistique, on a tous ces constats qu'on a remarqués dans les écrits scientifiques, et même des décès prématurés. Donc, comment est-ce possible que quelqu'un qui parle mal la langue, le français, l'anglais au Canada, à cause de ça, en a perdu sa vie? Est-ce possible? Alors oui, c'est malheureusement possible. Je travaille avec des coronaires qui ont examiné des cas, qui ont démontré que la perception que certains prestataires de santé, notamment ici les ambulanciers, ont attribué à l'immigrant, ici l'immigrante, parce que la plupart sont des femmes, qui, cette personne-là n'avait pas de papier, ne parlait pas français, et donc nous n'avons pas eu au Québec depuis une vingtaine d'années des décès suite à une grossesse ectopique. C'est quasi impossible pour celles qui ont eu des grossesses ectopiques, ça fait tellement mal qu'on ne peut pas rester à rien faire. Et là, c'était vraiment un cas extrême. Donc elle a été perçue autrement, elle a mal été comprise, et finalement, entre autres circonstances, une des circonstances de décès est la langue, de par le fait qu'elle était aussi immigrante et n'avait pas de papier. Alors, l'ambulance est allée à l'hôpital sans le gyrophare et est arrivée trop tard. Et c'est depuis juste 5-6 ans que les coronaires documentent dans les rapports la barrière linguistique comme étant une circonstance de décès. Alors, je pense que ça donne une leçon de responsabilité en termes de ce que je vous ai présenté pour les articles de loi. Alors, je ne passerai pas au deuxième cas parce que je n'ai pas beaucoup le temps. Je voudrais vous parler d'autre chose. Évidemment, c'est assez désespérant. L'autre cas que je voulais illustrer qui nous font rappeler les politiques dont parlait tout à l'heure Jane et la responsabilité de notre système de santé est le cas de l'excision et de l'infibulation qui donc représente certainement cette trajectoire de vie et auquel nous, intervenants de la santé, sont préoccupés et sont confrontés. Alors voici en gros ici les pays d'où proviennent les immigrants qui pratiquent l'excision et l'infibulation et qui arrivent donc dans des pays comme le Québec et le Canada pour pouvoir s'y installer. Alors je vais aller un petit peu plus vite dans mes données parce que le point principal est plus vers la fin, pour vous montrer qu'on n'en a pas tant que ça nécessairement qui arrivent. Le pourcentage total des personnes qui arrivent des pays pratiquants n'est pas si énorme. Il y a certaines concentrations, surtout au niveau de l'Ontario et du Québec antérieurement. Ici, je voudrais juste noter que j'ai rajouté quelques autres logos parce que c'est un travail que je fais en collaboration avec d'autres Canadiens, notamment des collègues basés à Winnipeg. Tiens, j'aurais pu voir Lucie là-bas. Au Manitoba, et elles font un travail extraordinaire d'accueil des immigrantes qui vivent justement l'excision de l'infibulation, et la majorité des immigrants et des immigrantes qui vont dans le Manitoba de par la régionalisation canadienne viennent des pays pratiquants. Alors voilà, donc l'Ontario aussi, et ce qu'on ne sait pas, et ce qu'on doit enseigner, et ce qu'on doit avoir comme responsabilité, c'est de pouvoir sortir des classifications cliniques habituelles et de voir de quelle façon il y a aussi des classifications plus culturelles, ça c'est beaucoup plus clinique, et de comprendre aussi le fait qu'il y a des débats, que ce sont un peu comme disait ce matin ma collègue, quand on parle d'intersectionnalité et de sensibilité aux mots qu'on utilise et la façon qu'on va pouvoir intégrer les personnes immigrantes et surtout les femmes qui vivent de façon assez dramatique cette première présence dans notre système de santé, de par le fait qu'elles sont enceintes, elles sont prêtes à accoucher et elles sont infibulées. Donc ça crée quand même une certaine réaction auprès de nos intervenants pour pouvoir mieux comprendre un peu ce qu'elles ont à gérer. Alors, évidemment, j'ai eu l'occasion de faire un petit travail là-dessus il y a quelques années qui nous démontre certainement cette responsabilité n'est pas encore tout à fait bien comprise au niveau du système dans l'accueil des personnes immigrantes. Alors, évidemment, ici, ce que j'aimerais faire ressortir en termes de rapport de genre et d'immigration, c'est toute cette question éthique où les camps sont souvent divisés en deux. Certaines, les femmes elles-mêmes nous disent que c'est très important, on est fiers de pouvoir permettre à notre fille d'être soit excisée, soit infibulée, et en même temps, on a le même discours, les mêmes femmes qui tiennent un discours opposé. Donc on ne peut pas homogénéiser, on a besoin d'être mieux informés de ce que vivent ces femmes qui arrivent au Canada. Et on nous dit souvent aussi, mais c'est vrai, puis hier on a parlé un petit peu, hier soir, de toute cette question de cette semi-caché esclavage ou violence sous d'autres formes plutôt européennes qui sont quand même tout à fait là, et la question du domestic work, certainement dans l'exploitation qui est faite, peut être discutée dans les mêmes perspectives. Alors, l'autre chose ici que je voulais vous montrer, c'est que ces femmes qui arrivent ici, qui vivent ces conditions dramatiques, et on ne sait pas trop comment elles vivent leur santé, on a l'impression que bon, c'est quelque chose qui est acquis pour elles-mêmes. Ma collègue Gillian Einstein, qui a travaillé, qui est psychologue et qui a mesuré par des électrodes donc la sensation de douleur au niveau de la région périnéale, des femmes qui disaient que non, tout va bien, nous on est habitués à être infibulés, à être comme ça, c'est la norme, et on leur dit avez-vous des douleurs? Non, tout va bien. Et quand on mesure par nos moyens très sophistiqués, on voit que les mesures quantitatives nous montrent qu'il y a de la douleur, que ce n'est pas la même variable que ce que les femmes qui n'ont pas été touchées dans cette région-là pourraient comme souffrir. Alors ce que j'aimerais faire, donc, c'est essayer de conclure, parce que c'est le moment de conclure. En termes de politique, ce que j'aimerais vous montrer, c'est qu'au Canada, nous avons eu donc cette situation, et en 1993, il y a eu la loi C-27, qui a permis donc de mieux circonscrire donc cette pratique traditionnelle qui se faisait soi-disant au Canada, et donc qui est maintenant passible de crime. Et il y a aussi la Société des obstétriciens gynécologues du Canada qui essaie de s'adapter et de voir à des lignes directrices pour mieux intervenir auprès de ces personnes. Alors, je crois que je vais passer un petit peu plus rapidement sur ça et vous donner... Là, j'ai essayé de retrouver les flèches de votre logo pour essayer d'expliquer que nous avons encore beaucoup de défis à essayer de répondre. Vous connaissez l'accommodement raisonnable, n'est-ce pas, qui n'aide pas beaucoup, je crois, en termes de rapport société-genre. Ça a été un peu une blague. Le réseau de la santé, nous avons beaucoup de personnes qui arrivent, un employeur majeur, mais hélas, vous avez vu mon taxi, cardiologue, des qualifications professionnelles majeures, notamment les femmes. On nous propose, par exemple, maintenant des postes cadres, pour ces gens-là, mais de nuit, de soir. Vous pensez que les femmes vont pouvoir bénéficier de se remettre au niveau de la profession alors que c'est de soir ou de nuit? À mon avis, je crois qu'il y a encore beaucoup de travail à faire, à revoir comment est-ce qu'on va... Attendez, je vais enlever quelque chose, je voulais vous remercier. Je crois qu'on a encore beaucoup de responsabilités justement à essayer de répondre à nos responsabilités d'accueil des immigrants. Donc à mon avis, on accueille, mais on n'a pas encore mis ces politiques en application pour... permettre cette interaction, rapport, société, genre, immigration, pour nous permettre d'être mieux compétents, comme on l'était avant. Et voilà, je vous remercie beaucoup. On terminera avec la discussion. Je suis désolée d'avoir...